Your Excellency Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich, Consul General Mr. Fran Bernchik, Chief Justice of Victoria, the Honourable Marilyn Warren, other distinguished members of the Judiciary, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Carolyn Evans. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and on behalf of my colleagues and our students, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the 2011 Nathan and Pamela Jacobson public lecture by His Excellency Jeffrey Bleich, American Ambassador to Australia, who will be addressing the important and timely topic, eliminating violence against women, changing law, changing culture. I begin today by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's proceedings are being recorded and will be available on our website following the lecture. We're here tonight because of the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Nathan and Pamela Jacobson, who we are fortunate enough to have here with us tonight. I'd like to take this opportunity to express the sincere gratitude of the Law School for your ongoing support of this lecture series. I deeply appreciate your commitment, your interest, your involvement behind the scenes that have allowed us to offer this important series, and we welcome particularly the friends and family of the Jacobsons who are here tonight. Some of you know Mr. Jacobson very well, but for those who don't, I find the story of his life quite inspiring, and I'd just like to share a little bit about it with you. He is a graduate of this law school, which we're very proud of. He studied here in the 1940s. He was a talented and dedicated student who'd earlier matriculated in Poland amid, of course, a time of rising anti-Semitism, and arrived here in Australia in 1936. He only had quite limited English at that time, and he was determined to go to university here in Australia and tried very hard to persuade various faculties to take him in, ultimately managing to persuade the law faculty that as a speaker of Polish and Russian who'd managed to learn Hebrew in only 3 months, they could be confident he would improve his abilities where English were concerned and so cope even with the difficult law courts of the time. Well, events proved him quite right. He went on to study law part-time, studying in the morning and evenings, working full-time to support his family, who subsequently joined him in Melbourne. Following graduation, he found success as a corporate lawyer, including as a founding partner of Jacobson, Chamberlain and Casson. He became a prominent member of the Australian Jewish community and was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1972. I think his is a story of the power of hard work, determination and perhaps a sense of humour to overcome the obstacles placed in his life early on, and also a commitment to education, which frankly humbles people like me who are engaged in education. We are indebted to both of you, Mr. and Mrs. Jacobson, for your continuing interest tonight. It now gives me great pleasure to move on to introduce our speaker this evening, His Excellency Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich. Mr. Bleich received his Bachelor of Arts from Amherst College, his Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University, and his law degree from the University of California at Berkeley Law School, where he later taught international human rights law. Following graduation from law school, he clerked for Chief Justice Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court, as well as Justice Abner A. McVick of the DC Circuit. Now, as any of the lawyers in the audience will know, that is an outstanding start to a career, and as you would expect, he's gone on to have an extraordinary career. His achievements are indeed so numerous that if I listed them all, you'd spend all night listening to me instead of him, and that's not really the point. Let me just highlight a few of them that are particularly relevant to tonight's talk. He served as a law clerk to Judge Howard Hotzman on the Iran-US Claims Tribunal. He acted as Special Rapporteur on the International Court of Arbitration. He assisted the Special Prosecutor for the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and represented the American Bar Association before the United States Supreme Court in several matters, including the Medellin case concerning the Vienna Convention on Consular Rights, which will be familiar to many of us here. He served as Special Counsel to President Obama at the White House, and he is now, of course, the 24th American Ambassador to the Commonwealth of Australia. As you can appreciate from this, frankly, brief subsection of his very many achievements, we have here with us tonight somebody of extraordinary intellectual scope and exceptional credentials as both an internationalist and a defender of human rights. We're very grateful to him for taking the time tonight to come and talk on this critical topic, and I would now like to call upon him to deliver the 2011 Nathan and Pamela Jacobson Lecture on Eliminating Violence Against Women. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much to Melbourne Law School for inviting me to be here tonight. I particularly want to thank Nathan and Pamela Jacobson for their generous support of this lecture series. It's a great honor to be able to deliver your lecture. I think it's a tribute to your generosity and your spirit that you have a lecture hall full of people here tonight. And I also want to thank everyone who's here to join us for such an important topic, to address the critical issue of eliminating violence against women. And finally, I want to thank you, Dean Evans. I know how difficult it is to do these introductions because I just had to introduce the president. And so I looked up on Google, other introductions of presidents to see if I could get some ideas. And the story that stuck with me was there was a person named Chauncey Depew, and he was introducing President William Taft. And for those who aren't familiar, William Taft was a larger-than-life figure. He was not only the President of the United States, but he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was also larger-than-life physically. He was over 400 pounds. They actually had to create a special bathtub in the White House for him. He was tall and very big. So he was being introduced by a person named Chauncey Depew, who gave a very, very long introduction and got very worked up towards the end of it. And he said, "So I give to you the President of the United States, William Taft, a man pregnant with integrity, pregnant with courage, the President." And so William Taft comes up after this introduction, and he says, "If it is a girl, I shall name her Integrity. And if it is a boy, I shall name him Courage. But if, as I suspect, it is simply gas, I shall name it Chauncey Depew." So, I was just grateful to get through my introduction safely, and I also want to thank you for the lovely and very touching introduction by you, Dean Evans. My topic tonight is one that historically diplomats have talked about too little. Too often we talk about foreign policy in a way that divorces it from what's happening in our homes. But what happens in a person's home never stays just in that house. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, it spills out into our communities and across our world. And there are few things that are as corrosive to a society, not to mention the human spirit, as violence against women. Now, for most of our histories, even the most progressive countries have avoided dealing with the issue of domestic violence. And even our countries, the United States and Australia, we did that for many years. We treated it as a private matter. And if you go back and look at old movies from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, you will see images of men hitting and slapping women, wives, girlfriends. And there are no police cars rushing up to the scene. There are no safe houses, no shelters, no family counseling programs. Now, part of this was just ignorance about the real effects of domestic violence, and part of it was sexism. Men ran our governments, and it just wasn't their issue. But brave women came out of the shadows, and they began to tell their stories. And those stories revealed that violence at home isn't the victim's problem. It's all of our problem. And that means the government needs to be involved. Now, you've probably heard, particularly now during White Ribbon Week, people say that domestic violence affects us all. But let me tell you what that really means. First, let's talk about the spouse or partner, the victim who lives in fear every day. Living this way is an injustice in and of itself. It's stealing their freedom, it's stealing their liberty, their pursuit of happiness, potentially their life. But it's an economic crime too. Victims of abuse are often trapped in their homes. They miss work, They suffer physical injuries that limit what they can do. Many women and girls, they lose hope, and they suffer from depression. And these are mothers who can't care for themselves or for their families, and whose full potential is taken away from all of us in society. We need these women to be full economic partners. And just to put it in perspective, Secretary Clinton was recently talking about this issue, and she said over the past decade, the increase in economic growth that came from women entering the workforce was equal to all of the growth that came from China. And it's worth saying that again. All of the economic growth that we've seen coming from China has been equaled simply by women entering the workforce in developed countries. So, if we want to grow as economies, we need to take full advantage of the potential of women. And women, I need to admit this as a man, have greater potential economically than men in many ways. Women prove to be much stronger savers than men. They spend more of their earned income on food, on health care, on home improvement, and on schooling for their children. So it's this simple. When we diminish the opportunities for women, we diminish ourselves. Then there are the men, the abusers. These men aren't better off by virtue of domestic abuse. They're degrading and diminishing themselves. They live with self-loathing and disgust. They're hated by their own children. They're destroying themselves as well. And economically, they often end up in jail or a morgue or in their own downward spiral of poverty, consuming our law enforcement resources, and again, hurting all of us. And then there are the children. I just want to have everyone think for a moment what it's like to be a child growing up in a violent home where your mother's abused. Every single day, you're scared. They're scared that their mother will be beaten, that she could die. They're scared that they'll say something that triggers their father's rage or exposes what's happening within their home. They're scared that they're going to be beaten themselves. They're scared each time their father comes home, but they're also scared that their father may not come home, and there won't be any income, no food. They wake up every morning with this sick feeling in their stomachs, and they can't concentrate in school. They're anxious every moment that they're in their home. They hate their father for beating their mother. They hate themselves for not stopping it. They're just consumed with guilt and fear and hate. And so do we wonder why a child who's raised this way is more likely to express hate and fear and violence against others? To think that the only way that they can solve their problems is through violence itself. And this is a cycle that bleeds into every aspect of our society. When I served as the director of President Clinton's White House Commission on Youth Violence, we studied all the causes of youth becoming violent. And we looked at drugs and alcohol, education, family income. We looked at violent video games and movies, access to weapons. We looked at every one of the possible predictors that you might have expected. And the single greatest predictor of future violence is exposure to violence in your own home or community. It is a cycle. And those who grow up this way are more likely to be violent. They are more likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to use drugs. They are more likely to become pregnant as teenagers, to commit suicide, to suffer from depression, to end up homeless or institutionalized or dead. So violence in the home leads to a vicious cycle of violence, poverty, and disease that destroys more than the family. It corrodes and corrupts societies. So we know now that this is not just a problem for the victim, and it's not just a problem for the family, and it's not just a problem for their country. It is a staggering global problem, a problem that affects each and every one of us. So in the 1960s, things began to change in the United States, and it started with a grassroots campaign to educate the public and to strengthen laws against violence, to train hospital workers, to train law enforcement personnel and police, to recognize the signs of domestic abuse, to teach judges about how to punish or to treat abusers. And it meant teaching courts and equipping courts with the proper resources. It meant giving women safe places to go and giving them support for their children. And it also meant understanding how domestic violence affected different communities differently. For example, we discovered an epidemic of domestic violence among Native American women, mostly on tribal lands in the United States. And sadly, I think this is an area where our respective indigenous communities share a common challenge. Native American women and girls in the United States today are 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted compared to all other races. And the majority of these assaults are by spouses or intimate partners. So we've had to create a different kind and a different degree of engagement in tribal communities. We conduct listening sessions, for example, with tribal counterparts. And this is an ongoing process. I think the most recent one was earlier this year, 2011, out in South Dakota. And based on that, we're adding new legislation to fill gaps in the law and to allow federal and Native American law enforcement agencies to hold perpetrators accountable. But it's an ongoing process. Nonetheless, if you look back since the 1960s, we have made tremendous progress on this issue. And we've seen proof of it. Over the past few decades, we started to get some real figures once we were able to get domestic violence reporting out of the shadows and could begin measuring the number of acts of abuse. And we've been able to see the numbers falling. Between 1993 and 2008, for example, the annual incidence of domestic violence in the U.S. dropped by 53%, over half. And the number of fatalities caused by an intimate partner declined 32% in that same period. Now, a lot of that was due to the grassroots efforts that I was just describing, but a lot of it was due to the fact that the government stepped in and started to recognize that stopping abuse is part of government's job. In 1994, my friend, who was then a senator, now he's our vice president, Joe Biden, introduced, and then President Bill Clinton signed into law, the Violence Against Women Act. And it established an Office of Violence Against Women, and it put real money into stopping domestic violence. In the past 15 years, this Office of Violence Against Women has awarded over $4.7 billion in funding to local, state, and tribal governments. It's also given money to courts, to nonprofits, to community organizations, and to schools. Let me just describe some of the things that it does. It paid for training hospital workers and law enforcement. It helped fund crisis centers and shelters. It provides lawyers to victims and to the children of victims. It creates model laws that states and local governments can employ. In Arizona, for example, it funded better evidence collection for sexual assaults in domestic situations. In Montana, it funded a review of all the fatal domestic violence cases. In Mississippi, it trains employees in the military to spot abuse and to stop abuse. In North Dakota, it funds an advocate on college campuses where there has been an increase recently in sexual assaults. And across the country, it encourages stiffer penalties for people who are committing every type of gender-based violence, whether it's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And it delivered a very clear message. There's no excuse for domestic abuse. It is never justified. And yet, despite all this progress, over the past several years, we discovered that the numbers have plateaued. We had a dramatic drop for a number of years, and now the drop has stopped. And so we spent some time trying to understand what has caused that. In fact, what we've seen in the past few years has been a modest increase in some domestic violence. And there appear to be two significant barriers to further reductions in domestic violence. The first was the belief, held by men and women alike, that violence against women is a women's issue. And so only half of the population has been working on the issue, advocating on the issue, and taking responsibility for its success. And arguably, it's the half that hasn't been taking leadership is the half that has the most to contribute, because men are responsible for most of the violence. 90% of domestic violence is committed by men. So men not only commit most of the violence, but they largely define our response to violence. If other men tolerate it, or ignore it, or blame the women who've been abused, then this tells abusers that it's not a big deal. Now, the other significant barrier was believing that this is a local issue. Violence against women, though, does not respect borders. It doesn't know where your neighborhood ends or where your national border is. Nations like the US and Australia are nations of immigrants, and those who come to our countries bring with them the traditions of their native lands, good and bad, and the psychological damage and baggage that comes with it. Their nations as well suffer from all the things I was describing: violence, poverty, spread of disease, and the other effects of gender-based violence that spill across to other nations. It's an issue that destroys their communities, it degrades their entire societies, and again, those effects spread over to us. So in the United States, we've done two things. First, we've taken domestic violence and made it a front and center part of our international policy strategy. It's not a peripheral issue. It is a centerpiece, a cornerstone of our foreign policy. And second, we have made a concerted effort to engage men in the issue. So let me start with the international strategy, since this is a lecture on international law. Back in Beijing conference in 1995, then Senator Hillary Clinton issued the memorable phrase that women's rights are human rights. Human rights belong to all women. And we've made a commitment to preventing violence against women, cornerstone of that human rights agenda. Today, at the highest levels of our government, in the White House, the State Department, state capitals around the United States, ending domestic violence is now a core commitment. President Obama, when he entered office, first months, appointed a first ever White House advisor on violence against women, Lynn Rosenthal. Secretary Clinton, within a month of entering office as our Secretary of State, appointed our first ever ambassador for global women's issues, Milan Verveer, to champion these issues, to inspire change and to recognize champions in overcoming domestic violence. We've strengthened enforcement of our Violence Against Women Act, and we've worked to pass stricter measures, including we're now seeking passage of an international Violence Against Women Act in our Congress. And this past month, the entire month, was National Domestic Violence Month in the United States, with education programs all across the country. The reason that we're putting in this kind of effort at the highest level, in the White House and the State Department, is because this challenge is going to require that type of an effort. It is a massive, massive challenge. 1 in 3 women worldwide will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. For women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44, it causes more death and disability than cancer, traffic accidents, malaria, and war combined. That violence cuts across ethnicity, race, class, religion, education level, international borders, It has the potential to affect women and girls at every point in their lives. And when we use this term, we're including female infanticide, child marriage, trafficking in women, domestic violence, female genital mutilation, honor killings, the mistreatment of widows, and rape as a tool of war. This type of violence not only spreads disease, it actually radically increases the rate of HIV and AIDS, especially among adolescents in areas with epidemic rates of domestic violence. So we're engaging the issue at every level. This means providing services for victims. It means strengthening deterrence. It means working with NGOs and civil society, particularly faith-based communities, reaching out to the churches and other religious leaders. We're working to ensure that both boys and girls have equal access to education and to economic opportunity, because again, that breaks down some of the causes for domestic violence. And just to give you some sense, USAID, which is our agency for international development, we're putting our money where our priorities are. More than half of our education programs focus on women. 60% of our microfinancing loans go to women. And nearly a third of the clients who receive USAID-supported business training are women. We're also helping to change laws in countries around the world. We're helping Albania, for example, develop legislation against domestic violence. They didn't have legislation against domestic violence in Albania. And we're training government officials and NGOs in how to respond and enforce these laws. In Mozambique, we helped draft new laws on forced sex and sexual slavery. And we also had to create an awareness campaign that brought this entire subject to light, since no one talked about it, so no one knew what the laws were or that they could be protected by them. In Cambodia, where women and girls have been attacked with acid, we're helping to end gender-based violence through public education, advocacy, and law enforcement resources. Let me give you a story of the Congo. Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Verveer went to the Congo, and they were horrified by the widespread use of rape and sexual terror as a tactic of war in the eastern provinces. Violence against women and girls was pervasive throughout the rest of the country as well, but particularly in the eastern provinces, it was just rampant. So since then, we have launched a comprehensive strategy to address gender-based violence there. And we did it with the Congolese government, but again, it was going after perpetrators, showing that there is no impunity for them. We provided increased protection for women and girls, particularly in vulnerable populations. We increased access to services for survivors to help them with the psychological challenges. And we have been funding a wide range of programs through every group we can, NGOs, faith-based organizations. And Ambassador Verveer went back there. That was 2 years ago that they made their first trip to the Congo. She went back there with a delegation recently, and they've actually seen signs of change. The military justice system is strengthened, and it is, in fact, prosecuting and locking up perpetrators. There have been many arrests, investigations, and prosecutions have increased. And so this does work, but it is hard work. Here in this region, the U.S. is no better friend in the world. Well, actually, there's nowhere in the world we have a better friend than Australia. But here in this region, the U.S. is no better friend than Australia in combating violence, particularly in the Pacific Islands. Just looking beyond its borders, as Australia does on so many, many issues, it has taken the lead in addressing violence against women in this region. Earlier this year, in Canberra, I participated in the Australia-US Women's Empowerment Policy Dialogue. That was launched here a year ago in Melbourne by Secretary Clinton and Foreign Minister Rudd. They made a commitment together that the US and Australia would address domestic violence in the Pacific Islands. Now, the situation for women in the Pacific Islands is dire. For example, in Papua New Guinea, you know how I said that 1 in 3 women would experience violence or sexual violence in their lifetime. In Papua New Guinea, it's over 2/3 of women will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. More than half are subjected to forced sex. And if victims report these crimes, they risk being assaulted by the police as well. Without question, we need very fundamental reform. Now, Australia has helped to strengthen the legal system in Papua New Guinea. The number of female village magistrates, which used to be 40, is now over 500 just in the last 3 years. Another 200 women are currently being trained. And this type of change helps give women a voice, an advocate, a chance at justice, and a powerful role model in the community. At the policy dialogue, Foreign Minister Rudd shared the story of one of PNG's first women magistrates, Mrs. Rhoda Gita, and these are her words. She said, "As a woman and a mother, when domestic violence comes up, I try and get women talking. In a case where a man hit a woman in the market for not getting his food, I made him switch places with her for a week so he could learn what it was like for her running her stall all day, looking after children, cooking his food. After 3 days, he came and he said, now I understand why I made the order. And I told him he still had to finish the week because that was his penalty. And at the end, he came back and he apologized to his wife." Now, Australia has announced at the policy dialogue that it's going to provide an extra $5 million to support this sort of work, not only at PNG, but also at the Vanuatu Women's Center. And as a result of that, up to 15,000 women survivors are going to receive counseling services, are going to have access to legal assistance, and they're going to get emergency accommodation. Now, this is desperately needed because in Vanuatu, 60% of women suffer from violence in their domestic relationships. And sometimes the barriers here are so basic. The Australian Federal Police were in Vanuatu, and they were talking to an advocate, and they learned that, in fact, there was a substantial number of women in the police force who were sympathetic to and committed to enforcing laws against domestic violence, but they weren't allowed to drive. So what we need to do is not train them, but get them driver's licenses and change the laws so that they can drive. So there is plenty that we can do internationally, and the US and Australia are doing it together. Now let me talk at last about the other barrier, which I mentioned. And here I see a number of people. Paul over there has got the white ribbon. In fact, I see a few white ribbons in the room. As I said, domestic violence is every bit a man's issue. Secretary Richard Marles, who's a Pacific Island minister here, said it better than I could. He said, "Young men and boys can help ensure that girls go to school. They can ensure that women and girls are safe from violence, that they're not married at a young age against their will, that they don't bear the whole burden of work in the household, that they can earn a living and play their part in society, and that they would not be victims of violence ever." The simple version is what I tell my sons, which is they should treat any girl that they date the way they would like another boy to treat their sister. Now, about 6 years ago, Vice President Biden and I got involved with a group it was then called the Family Violence Prevention Fund, now it's called Futures Without Violence, to help establish the Founding Fathers Campaign, which was to take a stand against domestic violence. And on Father's Day 6 years ago, and every Father's Day since, we've published an open letter in the New York Times calling on all men to remember what fatherhood's really about. We asked them to take the same pledge that you have in the White Ribbon Campaign, that you will not commit abuse, that you will not tolerate abuse, that you will not stand silently or excuse abuse. And we asked people to donate money for an international center to train people around the world in how to stop domestic abuse in their home communities. And I remember when we started this, everyone said, you know, no one likes to talk about domestic abuse, and no one wants to give money to create an international center to train people in a subject that they don't want to talk about. In fact, we broke ground on it a year ago. I was out there with Nicole Kidman, who's the UNIFEM ambassador, and we are opening the doors in January to this international center. So, the White House as well has picked up on this message that men need to be involved. On his first Father's Day in the White House, and at every Father's Day since, President Obama has delivered a message focusing on enlisting men and dads around the world in the effort to stop violence against women. And now, for the first time in the history of our Justice Department, we have the Office of Violence Against Women embarking on a new program specifically designed to engage men and boys as allies with women and girls in this issue. And then we see the same thing here. It's wonderful to come to Australia and see you're already ahead of us with the White Ribbon Campaign. I know that Police Chief Commissioner Ken Lay wanted to be here tonight, and I wanted to thank him for the new policy initiative that he established. It's a public awareness campaign to tackle domestic violence. And earlier today, I was out at the Melbourne Storm, where they have the Be the Hero program, which has been adopted in local high schools and which Paul has championed. That's being done where you get Melbourne Storm players to step up and set a new role model for what it means to be a strong man. Strength doesn't equal violence. And we are working with AusAid to make men part of the solution in Papua New Guinea. Now, as you all know, here at a law school, we're used to talking in terms of laws solving our problems. You know, if we pass a new convention or a new treaty, maybe this will go away. But this is not something that words on paper will stop. It is a change in culture. It's a change in attitude. It's an international effort that lawyers who care about this issue need to work on simultaneously, both in the policy field and also in enacting laws to give teeth to those policies. But it's not going to be done in a day or a week or even a year. This is a generational change. It's about teaching people all over the world about fathers respecting the wives and mothers who brought their children into the world. It's about teaching our daughters that no one has the right to mistreat them. And it's about teaching our sons that violence doesn't equal strength. It won't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. So I just want to thank you all for coming here tonight, for your interest in this, for your support of this issue, and for the inspiration you give me. As a wise president once said, yes, we can. So, thank you.
Just before we have the final thank you to the Ambassador, I'd like to call on Mr. Nathan Jacobson to say a few words. I don't know if you want to sit down for this last bit.
Is that okay? Not as bad as it looks. Madam Dean, Your Excellency the Ambassador, how does one correctly address the consular? Your Highness, Your Eminence, Your Holiness, or just Consul General? What's the correct form of address?
It's Your Holiness.
I'm deeply indebted to the Ambassador for accepting the Dean's invitation to deliver his address to us. It was inspiring, it was full of depth, it was delivered with the greatest of eloquence, no less than I expect from a member of the legal fraternity. I would like to congratulate you on address and wish you a very successful term of office in Australia. You probably know by now that you are in a country which is very friendly to the United States. People of my age, and there's not many of them left, are very deeply indebted to the United States for putting bluntly, saving Australia in 1941 or 42. We'll never forget that. This sort of friendship, nothing can buy. No money, no affection, nothing. We remember that. We know that with the latest developments and the growth of China, and I'm not getting involved in controversial politics, far be it from me. I've been married long enough to avoid any controversy. I want you to know that you're in a very friendly background, and difficult as your task may be, it will be made easier by being surrounded by so many friends. Your Excellency, I owe you another debt. You're laden with debts. Since your topic was announced, that steps are being taken to prevent violence against women, my wife, Pamela, became a much calmer person. She doesn't seem to be worried so many things, and every day she asks me when the law will be passed. By the way, she's only concerned about Australia, not Nigeria, not Timbuktu, not any of the other countries. So thank you for that as well. This is a historic occasion to have an opportunity to hear such an outstanding address. It's full of deep analysis and indeed a credit, as I mentioned before, to a fellow of legal fraternity. As far as legal fraternity is concerned, I think you have achieved the ultimate. To be the senior advisor to the President of the United States. I can't think of a higher honor. I can think of people that make more money in commercial law. But when it comes to status, when it comes to advice, and I doubt how many of our friends here appreciate the fact that you've got two jobs. One is to solve all the president's legal problems, and the other one to stop the president from getting into legal problems. That's indeed, by any standard, is a very, very demanding task. I'm almost finished.
That's good.
Not quite. I appreciate the smile on your face. The rapport with Australia, I don't doubt, will bear much more fruit in the future, although I can't imagine or any complaints about the rapport in the past. If I were to be in the unlikely event of me being ambassador and the president would give me the choice of a country, I would still choose Australia. I'm a graduate of this university in law. I am deeply indebted for an opportunity I had not only to study law and to subsequently to practice law, more or less successfully, but to acquire the knowledge of the world at large. Those days we had 9 law subjects and 6 general subjects, 5 what we used to call art subjects. And that gave you enormous depth of knowledge. To this day, I remember that one of the subjects was philosophy. And to this day, I simply cannot work out why we're given the subject, and I never understood a word of it. Shortly prior to my arrival in Australia, with very little knowledge of English, and this, my friends, is an overstatement. No, it's an understatement. I was admitted to the University of Melbourne, not on the basis of my English, it was really non-existent, but the basis of some experiences in Israel and Palestine, which I conveyed to the admitting officer, by which he judged my potential, not the young, innocent, bright-looking fellow, Pamela, that was me, standing before him. I'm eternally indebted to Professor Brown, who was then the Dean of Education. All other deans, including the Dean of Law, wouldn't admit it. And I had subsequent contacts. The story is much too long. But I am in eternal debt to the faculty and to the university, and I'll live up to my debt. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to thank the members of the family, and I'd like to wish you all the very best for the coming season. Thanks once again, Ambassador. Thank you.
He outperformed me, sorry.
Well, we've heard a wonderful thank you, so let me be very brief in my thanks. The Ambassador began by saying that diplomats have talked about this topic too little. It's perhaps worth noting that this was a topic that the Ambassador chose to speak on. This is not what we asked him. We asked him to speak on one of the standard topics you ask ambassadors to speak on, peace in the Middle East or democracy or whatever it might be. He said no. At this time, he wanted to speak about violence against women. He chose to stand up and give this clear, powerful, and in some ways quite personal analysis of the problems caused by domestic violence. His speech was unflinching in explaining in quite graphic detail the harms that domestic violence against women causes to the women and also to all of those touched by that violence. But it was not a counsel of despair. It reminded us of what has been achieved, and I think set out a challenge that the Ambassador's clearly taken up, but a challenge to the rest of us to take up this issue and to remember that the need for change is ongoing. We've come a long way, but we're by no stretch of the imagination there yet. And I hope you'll excuse it from me if I just add one little anecdote to those of the ambassadors. I was in Nepal last year, asked to be part of an international panel of experts on constitutional reform in that country. I was the only woman among the international panel of experts. So when the women's session was convened, I was, of course, told to go off and tell the women whatever it was that women happened to be interested in. Nobody was terribly sure of that. So off you go. And I had a speech prepared, but it was a smallish group of women, and I'd been talking to a few of them. I thought, really, none of these women need to hear from me. They've been doing this for decades. So I said instead, look, we're a small group. Why don't you all just spend a few minutes talking about your lives, what brought you here? As most of them were legislators, judges, community leaders of various kinds. And the stories of the courage, but the need for courage in the lives of these women, something that touched me deeply. They had all, without exception, experienced the most extraordinary physical violence. Almost all of them had experienced sexual violence, and that only intensified when they decided that they wanted to take on these community leadership roles. A number of them told me that in Nepal, to call a woman a leader was about the worst insult that you could possibly level against her. And yet they continued to work tirelessly. One of the women who was there is a very articulate, intelligent woman who'd had lots of offers to come and live in other countries. She could have easily walked into an NGO or as a professor in university, determined to stay in Nepal, determined to work for women in that country, and had just introduced into legislature a bill against domestic violence against women. And on the morning that she had introduced it, by that afternoon, the number of threats of death and gang rape that had entered into her mailbox, quite extraordinary. They kept saying to me, make sure you tell our story when you go back. So I just thought this was a good audience to share this story with. I have to say, I felt relatively powerless and helpless, but they didn't, despite all that they had battled against. So it is important that people are prepared to speak out on these issues. It takes some courage to do that in this country, but vastly more to do it in many other places. The Ambassador noted in his wonderful speech that too often violence against women is seen as a women's issue, is seen as a domestic issue. Well, he certainly followed his own advice tonight by showing that men must be part of the solution to that problem, that ambassadors at the international level have to and can be part of the solution to that problem. We are greatly indebted to him, and I'd ask you to join with me in thanking him as we give a small token of our appreciation.